Salam alaikum. Welcome to Kunafa and Shay, a podcast produced for HowlRound Theatre Commons, a free and open platform for theatre makers worldwide. Kunafa and Shay discusses and analyzes contemporary and historical Middle Eastern and North African, or MENA, and Southwest Asian and North African, or SWANA, theatre from across the region.
I'm Marina.
And I'm Nabra.
And we're your hosts.
Our name, Kunafa and Shay, invites you into the discussion in the best way we know how, with complex and delicious sweets like kunafa and perfectly warm tea, or in Arabic, shay.
Kunafa and Shay is a place to share experiences, ideas, and sometimes to engage with our differences. In each country in the MENA or SWANA world, you'll find kunafa made differently. In that way, we also lean into the diversity, complexity, and robust flavors of MENA and SWANA theater. We bring our own perspectives, research, and special guests in order to start a dialogue and encourage further learning and discussion.
Welcome to the 5th season of Kunafa and Shay, where we delve into the dynamic world of performance art across the region. We're highlighting the creative, innovative, and artistic disruption of performance artists, exploring how their art serves as a powerful medium for expression and social change. This season features interviews with performance artists who challenge norms and use their craft to further conversations about topics like identity, diaspora, homeland, and futurity.
In this episode, we talk with Palestinian artist Basma al-Sharif about her installation and film work. Palestinian artist and filmmaker Basma al-Sharif explores cyclical political histories and conflicts. In films and installations that move backward and forward in history, between place and non-place, she confronts the legacy of colonialism through satirical, immersive, and lyrical works. She received an MFA from the University of Illinois at Chicago in 2007, was a resident of the Fondazione Antonio Ratti in 2009, the Pavilion Neuflis, OBC, at the Palais de Tokyo in 2014 to 2015. She received a jury prize at the Sharjah Biennale in 2009, was awarded a Visual Arts of the Fondation Botin in 2010, Mofradat Consortium Commissions in 2018. She was a fellow of the Berlin Artistic Research Grant Program for 2022-2023 and was nominated for the Prix Award in 2024. Al-Sharif's major exhibitions include the Rutenberg Contemporary Photography Series for the Museum of the Art Institute of Chicago, Modern Mondays at MoMA, CCA Glasgow, the Whitney Biennale, here and elsewhere at the New Museum, Berlin Documentary Forum, and Manifesta 8. Her films have screened in the international film festivals of Locarno, Berlin, Mar del Plata, Milan, London, Toronto, New York, Montreal, and Yamagata, amongst others. Basma is based in Berlin and is represented by Galerie Iman Ferez in Paris. Basma, we are so glad to have you with us today. Thank you for being on Kunafa and Shay.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
We would love to start by going through your career journey. How did you start making art, and what motivates you today? Can you take us through a bit of your trajectory?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's done. It's of course it's in retrospect, but I think there was a lot of awareness even when I was a teenager that I wanted to contribute in some form to the struggle, to the Palestinian struggle. And I grew up around a lot of people who were active in different ways, like in very kind of tangible, clear ways, as like physicians or lawyers or activists on the ground or writers, people who worked in policy, this kind of thing, or even, like as revolutionary fighters. And I, growing up in diaspora, felt like, what is my strength? What's my power? What's my, like, how can I use the privilege that I have by being in diaspora? Of course, it's a double-edged privilege, but like how do I make use of growing up outside of Palestine, not in direct, like under the direct influence of the occupation? How can I still, contribute? And arts for me was something that was, sort of like natural, or it's a curiosity I had and a field that I was comfortable kind of that I was comfortable in as a kid, growing up as an adolescent. And so when I went to university, it was really clear I wanted to study art, and I wanted to use it as a way to kind of infiltrate with our narrative into that field. And at the time, there were, a good handful of Palestinian artists, but not like today. And it felt like a really important sort of niche to put that narrative into, which it didn't exist very much, like especially not in experimental cinema or in the way that it does today, which I think is amazing. And so that was for me sort of the entry. Like now I see it a lot clearer. I see it a lot more like this was for me the thing that felt the most tangible, the thing that felt the most like I speak this language, not just the English language, but like the Western canon, the art world in that way, and can sort of address our struggle in these spaces where they don't really talk about it, or where it's a different narrative is being privileged. So that's sort of my trajectory. I think now it's a question for me. It's a big. We're facing a really difficult moment, especially in the cultural sector, which is like overwhelmingly thrown us under the bus, our voices, and silenced us. And so it's really about reconfiguring what that means. Like before, it seemed important and necessary to speak in official platforms with our narrative, and now it feels like, oh yeah, but actually you never had our backs, and so we have to rethink where our voices are important or necessary, or how they can contribute to like kind of rebuilding the cultural sector. For us, and not just us Palestinians, but like all disenfranchised voices that are tokenized in the art world. So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I'm glad that you mentioned that too, because we had another artist, a Palestinian drag queen, who was on this season when we're talking about performance art, but also she was talking about how you have to reconceptualize your art whenever people not only don't have your back, but when the funding that you were maybe trying to apply for or get is actually not funding that you can that you want, because it's complicit in either genocide or other things. But so the recalibration seems to be happening on so many levels.
Definitely.
And as a creator, we know you through your film work. You also do installation. So can you tell us more about how you define yourself as an artist, what kind of work that you do and that you're drawn to?
I mean, I work primarily with moving image, but let's say that the moving image can be in the cinema or installation. My background is visual arts. It was actually in photography. But I studied in a very interdisciplinary program that allowed us to kind of think first in ideas and then in medium. And I kind of continue to work that way. So my work involves sometimes writing or drawing, photography, performance, like a mix of things, but predominantly it's been moving image. And I think was drawn to moving image because of its like immersive potential. And early on, I really decided for myself that the kind of work that I would make about Palestine wasn't going to be the kind of work that would be documentary or about information, like giving information or teaching history. Of course, that work is really important, but I felt like I was drawn to work that would be more visceral, more experiential, like something that you're not necessarily being told about a specific event or historical tragedy through my work, or you're not even like really entering into a narrative when you're looking in any of my pieces, but you're experiencing something of the struggle, of its violence, and of our desire for liberation, our fight for liberation. And I think it's just, yeah, I mean, I define myself as like a filmmaker, artist, and work across the two fields, but never fully in either. Like I don't feel fully a visual artist. I don't feel fully a filmmaker, but I also don't think those things matter so much. But yeah, I think it comes from actually like I'm a lot more drawn to music than anything, which is fun, which is a funny thing to not be a musician, but to be really, but yeah, maybe it's easier to also be inspired in that way. Like music is a thing that really drives a lot of my work, music and writing. So I also studied literature and writing, and feel like those are the two things that help shape a project most for some reason, is the writing and the idea of like the sound maybe of a piece.
That makes perfect sense because the very strong visuals and the really compelling soundscapes of your films are what really stand out. and to me in your filmmaking work. And for those who have not seen your films, which we'll link to in the transcript as well, can you talk about what they look like? Maybe describe one piece so folks have a visual to contextualize this, and maybe some of the connecting threads between your pieces.
Yeah, yes, that's a difficult question, but I think like I think my work can be defined as like none of it is necessarily narrative, none of it is documentary, but there are elements of narrative and documentary within them. So they're often looking at Palestine from a diasporic position. So often like the works for a while, because I developed my practice really from like nomadically, is what I keep saying. But over 15 years, I moved 3 different continents and a different city every 2 years, and every space. And there wasn't really a reason, to be honest, for like moving to these spaces. They weren't residencies or necessarily like grants. It was just like, I can't really explain it. I don't know why. It's just cities would run their course and I would need to leave, or I wouldn't be able to survive, or some kind of opportunity would come up. So the work kind of developed in this way where I would be making films about, or installations about Palestine, but from outside, from a, how do you call that? Like, yeah, just like an outside position, and thinking about the locality, like what does the local place give to that now? How does it see Palestine, or how does its history reflect on our struggle? And so my work often is like taking very specific ideas and translating them through image and sound into a kind of narrative, the construction of a narrative that looks at, again, a particular idea, and sort of lures you in through sound and music and often voiceovers and images that are not necessarily connected to what we're looking at, that's meant to produce another way of looking at the situation rather than directly looking at like what's happening on the ground or historically. We're looking at it through our own connection to the image that we're seeing. So the work is often a mix of like 16 millimeter Super 8 film, which is really lush and saturated in color. The sound is very it's meant to sort of like seduce you into the image or lull you into a kind of trance of what you're looking at. And there are images sometimes in Palestine, other times not at all. And it's I don't know what more I could say. There's a lot of like manipulation of the image. I often will have footage playing backwards. I often apply effects or like have clear sort of my hand. It was very clearly on the image, like slow motion or these kinds of things to really make you aware that you're not looking at something directly. You're looking at it from a different angle, and you're being asked to interpret from your position what these things mean, what the sum of these things mean that I'm presenting, let's say.
I'd love to talk about some of those specific motifs or ways that you manipulate footage, because I noticed some of what you just mentioned, that action playing in reverse, those very long durational shots. You also have these very ambient and sometimes disconcerting soundscapes. And also I noticed a lot of use of landscapes or outdoor locations. Can you talk about those elements? Why is there any one specific that you're like, I always like to use this because this, or kind of what they mean for you as these recurring motifs in your film?
I think no, each time is a different reason. Like playing things backwards is often really specific to that film, that scene, and will produce a really particular effect given the stuff that's around it. Like in home movies, Gaza, it opens on a shot that's in reverse, that's tracking outside of a window from the north of Gaza to central Gaza, I think. And when I was watching the footage, I was thinking, like, how do I announce that we are entering a space that is not usual, that is not normal, without saying something is wrong here, but just to have this imperceptible, like, oh, something's off, something's not right. And so I made that one. I played it backwards for that reason. In a different film, in Ouroboros, a longer film, there's a long sequence where also a woman is walking backwards through a house, and it's not immediately perceptible. But in that sequence, it was more about producing kind of an eerie, uncanny, like ghost-like presence of this person through this house to maybe similarly establish that something's off, let's say. So, but I would say it's a different it's a different, like even if the motif repeats, it's for different reasons in different films. But I think overall, like a lot of the effects are about really getting the audience to, or the viewer to, focus on what they're looking at. Like how did this image come to be made, and that this image, you know, contains sound and text or dialogue and is in a specific place, or it has specific characters. Like how do we understand the creation of this story that's being shared, or this image that's being shared, and what does it mean? And obviously when it's imbued with a lot of politics, it's really asking, like, it's demanding the audience work to decode it, and or also just like sort of settle back and allow it to wash over without knowing what's happening, and having a kind of emotional experience. Because that's often conversations I have with students when I show my work. It's like, well, I don't really know enough about the context or whatever. And when I ask them to start describing what they think they saw, actually it's very close to what it's after, without the specifics of the politics. I think sometimes it's like intimidating in the art world or with experimental cinema for people to feel like they can decode this stuff, but actually most people can. Like they can read cinema, they can read experimental cinema, or they can read visual arts. It's just it's become such an elitist sector that I think people are put off, or think it's like, you have to have studied it to understand it. So I think, I think I went on a tangent there from the question. I think, like the use of landscape, to return back, is, I'm obsessed with landscape, because for me, it's, you know, as a Palestinian from the diaspora who had access to Palestine and was going, you know, very frequently to Gaza growing up, like, it's strange, because for me Gaza is like where my mother's family is from. It's something actually very like banal, or stands like where we would go to see my cousins every summer, blah blah. But it was so, of course, like dramatic in its existence as a place, and the people there are very particular in an incredible way, in a way I haven't seen anywhere in the world. And I think, like, having this sense of, it's just a landscape, these are just people, but like, why are they being made to suffer this much? And that suffering has been since a long time, not just a year ago. Or to be put up with like these absurd conditions, and then you go somewhere else and like the landscape is so protected, so secure, so I don't know, like the idea of the nature preserve, the idea of like the countryside home, the idea of, I don't know, for me it's just like, it's a kind of obsession, like homes and landscapes and and nature are just like it's a weird fixation, an obsession, not in the like ecological sense, but actually just like how there just happens to be certain landscapes that are traumatized repeatedly, and others that are just like left alone. So it appears in my films, again, like in different ways for different purposes within a different film.
Oh, I appreciate you articulating, the last thing that you said, sort of about the banality of a place that you just go because this is family and home, but also then the drama of the landscape, or the dramatic nature of a landscape that is then treated so differently from other landscapes for no reason other than settler colonialism, if we want to say it very succinctly, but lots of other, like the Zionist project, etc. So I appreciate that, the binary that you set up there. And just, I also have to flag that because I come from such a theater background, like a pretty narrative theater background, honestly, that I do sometimes feel that way with experimental film of like, oh, am I reading this correctly? As though there is a correct way, first of all. But I really appreciate the moments that you sort of said that you have your hands on, because for me, those were moments that really just gave me the moment to pause and pay attention differently and to think differently. And I just appreciated the way that you were flagging them. And I'm so bad at saying this word, Ouroboros.
Ouroboros.
Thank you. Ouroboros. Nabra and I had a fight about how to say this yesterday. I'm still not great at it. But in Ouroboros, the woman walking backwards, as you were talking about, when she turns her head, there was a moment that I kind of gasped. Like there was this intake of breath for me, because I became sort of accustomed to the backwards movement, and then there was a change in it, and I just felt like, oh, okay, I'm quite immersed in this moment, and yeah, trying to find my point here of making something cogent. But I just really appreciated the last two things you said, and I wanted to parse them out a little bit more. Can we talk about Ouroboros? And if you were to describe that film, how would you like? I seem like I'm looking for like a narrative plot summary, and I'm not. But just a description of how you would maybe talk about that work.
Of course, yeah. And very simply, it was a film that I made in reaction to the 2014 war, which at the time was also described as genocidal. I think a lot of people kind of sort of forget that today, but it was the third of Israel's like large-scale military attacks in Gaza. Most of my family in Gaza had left at that point. I thought, how is it possible that we had a war that went on every single day that Israel wanted it to, with the blessings of the United States, and we watched this on screen and nobody was able to stop it. And I just felt like, okay, so the civilization has failed, and that doesn't mean that the Palestinian struggle is over, that there is a way for them to erase Palestinians off the face of the earth in the way that they very clearly seem to be trying to do. So what does that mean? It was a question, and it was a question with a lot of resentment behind it, because I also felt like, what does the accumulation of all these images and all this information and all of this like work towards our liberation or just even justice in our cause was like, what, why is it for nothing? How is it possible that this continues to happen? And so I wanted to make a film that took Gaza out of its isolation. So we stopped saying this is a unique thing, this is a unique problem, this is only because of them, and whatever excuses I don't even want to dignify how they justify the kind of bloodthirsty killing that's happening in Palestine. But that, how do we take this out of its isolation and reflect on it through different landscapes? So it's just a film that takes Gaza. The byline is sort of, it pays homage to Gaza through looking at it through different civilizations and other people, other struggles, and other landscapes. And so it's a meditative sort of landscape film that begins and ends with Gaza, and in between is taking you on a journey through this character who is just a vehicle for looking at these different landscapes in which we sort of pause and look at different constructions, different moments, very brief moments, but that for me was just asking the audience to consider, like, why is Gaza being repeatedly destroyed, but you can have a 13th century castle in Brittany that's protected? And why does, what does it mean to be a Native American who's speaking a language that is almost gone extinct, which is the language that's used in the beginning and end of the film? It also draws connections with an Italian anti-fascist writer that is quoted in the Italian section of the film, who was exiled to the south of Italy by Mussolini for writing against the war in Abyssinia. And so it's, these things are not necessarily obvious, they're coded in the film, but it's enough for me to just like plant them in the film in these really, I hope, lush landscape scenes, and to have them sort of collapse into each other, to not just look at Gaza as this, or Palestine as this unique, unexplainable case, but to think, this is part of a longer story, a longer history of upheaval and oppression, and without actually linking it only to other struggles, but to link it just to other landscapes, and take it out of the specificity of the current time and just look at it within the larger scheme of things. I think in a very a-traditional way. I'm not an intellectual. I'm not someone who's really into theory. So for me, it was more about making something visceral again, like that you could experience, that you would see Gaza and you would see it in relation to other sites, and you would see it in this different way than you might be used to seeing.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I mean, I really appreciate the nod that this is not exceptional, that it is part of these other crimes against humanity that have happened forever, but also to really challenge the viewer to say, okay, well, why this and not that? Why do we care about these other things? Because they've been recorded in history books, or because they're in a different place? But yeah.
Another element of Ouroboros that actually just yesterday at a Donia Productions meeting, which your aunt is part of, Manal. So a shout out to Manal for also connecting us.
Yes.
Some folks brought up the desire or need to share a alongside our narratives around what's happening right now in Palestine, also the beauty of Palestine and the beauty of Gaza, for people to better understand the more deeply the loss, and mobilize folks through art, through beauty as well. And I brought up your film because this Ouroboros, it shows these incredible landscapes and this beautiful homestead of this woman who's walking through what I'm guessing is her space, or orchards and such, and yet it doesn't also shy away from everything that you're talking about, all of the commentary and the connections to other global struggles and also the destruction of those landscapes. So it beautifully balances the celebration, the beauty, and the loss and crisis. So really appreciated that. And it's very difficult to do in art, to be honest, as well. So something we've been talking about a lot at Dunya Productions.
That's great to hear. It means a lot to hear that also.
I was wondering if there's a piece of yours that you feel especially resonates today. I mean, we've talked about Ouroboros, but is there something else that has been on your mind a lot lately that you've created in the past? Thinking about, I didn't really register that Ouroboros was from 2014. So is there any other pieces, older pieces, that you want people to return back to for the present moment?
Or just a correction, that Ouroboros is from 2017. I started working on it in 2014 in response to the war in 2014. Yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting question, this, because I made this film, I think in 2014, actually, called Oh Persecuted, and it was a commission by the London Palestine Film Foundation. The London, I can't remember what exactly they were called, but it was a commission based on engaging with films from the PLO archive, like a lot of the propaganda films that were made in solidarity with the struggle, that were not only made by Palestinian filmmakers. They were restoring these archives and asking a few artists to engage with the material. I was one of those artists. And it wasn't just to make film. I mean, there was, I think, Adania Shibli, the writer, was asked to contribute a text, or, like various things. So I'd been invited to, engage with a film I could pick, but they sort of suggested a few. And I came across this one film called Our Small Houses by Qasim Hawal, who's actually an Iraqi filmmaker who made this film in a very particular moment that looks at, that sort of puts Palestinians and Israelis side by side in the struggle as persecuted people who are now thrown together to fight for like liberation in a way. I mean, it's definitely from the business, looking at Palestinians and their struggle, but sort of equates them in this way that I felt was like, oh, we're so far from that moment. Like, look at how this film was made, I think, in the early 70s, I would say. And it's very powerful, it's very beautiful, and it's really talking about, just like, for me, it talks so much about how, I don't know how to characterize it anymore. I mean, it was a long time ago, but it was so real to me in the way that, like, the struggle just permeates into everybody's lives. Like, at that moment, it's the people on the ground in Palestine. And I was thinking, like, now we're in this phase where it's everybody, all Palestinians in diaspora. Like, you have Palestinians who were born and raised and never stepped foot in Palestine, who are so dedicated to the cause. It's like frightening, actually, in a good way, in a very good way. And I felt like it's such a different moment from when this film was made, and yet there's something persists. And how do we address it? And what is it that's changed? And how do I address that visually? So I made this film that's very experimental, that's like shot in black and white, 16 millimeter film, where I'm like painting over a projection of the film. And then I run it in reverse so that it looks like I'm uncovering the film. I don't know if that makes sense if you haven't seen it, but it's just, basically black and white scene of someone that looks like they're removing paint, let's say lifting paint off of a wall, and underneath is this film that's playing out by Qasim Hawal. So you hear it and you sort of see it, but not very directly. It's like the soundtrack is quite obnoxious and aggressive. And at the end, when the film like finishes, when the credits are about to roll, it's disrupted by this YouTube footage of like it's kind of like Spring Breaker. It was all taken from 2014 during the war. Of like, you know, all these super hot girls in bikinis partying in Israel, in Tel Aviv or in Haifa or whatever. Like in Israel, it was this sort of advertisement, like, come to Israel, the raves are amazing, the women are hot, everything's great, like all this stuff. So I ran those two films together in this like very violent way. So we're coming from the black and white to the sudden like very saturated party footage, and then I added like a GABA soundtrack, so a very hardcore like techno sounding soundtrack, and in the background of that of those scenes is a Greek belly dancer, very orientalist, that sort of appears and disappears in the background. And so the film was like, yeah, it was posing a lot of questions about like how women's bodies are used and how we think about Israelis versus Palestinians in terms of the struggle and how violently far away they are from each other, how these archives that are being restored are almost from like a different, you know, world actually compared to what we have today. And like, what does it mean to be a partying Israeli while you're massacring a population for your security? Like these were the questions that I felt were being posed in this film. And I couldn't stop thinking about the film. I mean, like it doesn't show that much, or it didn't used to show that much, because I think people are freaked out by it. I mean, it premiered at the New York Film Festival in the experimental program, and I felt like people were avoiding eye contact with me back then afterwards. And then I used to feel like, oh, I need to always be there for the Q&A of this film, because it seems, people can't decode it, or it feels really aggressive, or I don't know. And I don't know why, like, to be honest. I know it's an aggressive film. It's very like visually aggressive, but I mean, politically, it's not saying anything new. And I feel like since, for me, it was like an eerie prediction of this, you know, what happened at Nova Festival. Like, it's how do you justify, I'm sorry to use this language, but a fucking rave next to an open air prison? Like, it should just make everyone sick. It doesn't, like, we never need to justify violence, but how do you justify that? Like, how did the world know that this was the situation, the case, and then completely not understand why there was an attack? Like, the complete inability to contextualize. And so I've been thinking about this film from 10 years ago, which seemed to be saying that in a way, and has been shown a bit more now since, because I feel like it clicked for certain audiences that, like, this was not an attack. You know, October 7th wasn't something that just fell out of the sky by bloodthirsty animals. Like, this was in response to decades of violence and the very cruelty of something like a rave happening next to a population, 2 million people under siege for 17 years on top of decades of occupation. I think, so I feel like I keep thinking about that film. It's definitely like less poetic and less gentle, but it makes me happy that it seems to be getting a bit more recognition, not because it's a piece of mine, but just like that it's getting, like, it's clicking for people, and that makes me in a sense relieved to not have to keep explaining why these things, why there is violence from the Palestinian side.
I mean, I'm glad it's clicking too. I guess I can and I can't believe it's taken so long for certain things, but like, I hope that anyone who's listening who could program it somewhere, like, continues to. So this film sounds like it really is putting things together in a way that is now resonating with people, hopefully more, although it sounds like, I mean, as we know, it should have before too. Because you're right, in 2014, we were using the language of genocide to describe what was happening in Gaza. I sometimes find myself without words for the situation. So unbelievable is the word that I'll go with right now. But it has felt, believable because we've seen it continue. This season with Kunafa and Shay, we were using performance art sort of as our umbrella term, thinking of what is performance, and we really talk about theater a lot on the podcast, and so we really wanted to also talk about things like experimental film and artists who are doing these multidisciplinary things that aren't really lumped into just a theater landscape. How do you feel experimental film fits into the realm of performance art or installation work, if you do, I guess?
I mean, I think anything that takes like a more commercial form and sort of questions how it works is sort of they're all connected in some way, like experimental music and experimental or like performance art or experimental cinema, poetry, like anything that is. It's not that it's like rejecting a particular form. It's actually acknowledging a particular form and saying like, well, what else can it do, or how can we, use that to sort of subvert or cause people to think differently about something. So it's very useful in that sense. And I think it's come to sort of be understood as like marginal or like hard to decipher and maybe a bit like pretentious. And I sometimes agree with that, to be honest with you. Like sometimes I feel like, why is this form so unbearably dense and unpleasurable and hard? And it's the questions I ask myself about my own work. Like I'm not always happy when a piece is maybe being met too much with like questions or inability to read the material. I don't think that's useful always. And as artists, I think we decide how much we veer into like a very niche, specific kind of reading of a work, or like work that's made for an audience that can decipher it because they're in that world, or if we're trying to reach a wider audience. And always like it's a sliding it's a spectrum of like, for me, of sometimes I want things to be way more legible, sometimes I don't. And I think if that was the question, I'm not sure if I understood it correctly, but like that these different fields are really useful as ways to explore and question and like try new things and get people engaged in working a bit harder, or like being, I don't know, like curious again, not just being fed something, not just sitting back and like having the work do the thinking for you, but asking you to do thinking and to be kind of complicit in what the meaning is of a piece. I find that really pleasurable. I think when I feel I've been presented with something that's a little, like in an unusual form that I have to really like question, like, oh, is this what was meant? Or what do these things all mean together? Like this kind of thing. It feels exciting and it feels like I'm participating in the work. You know what I mean? I don't know if that makes sense, but it's like you're participating in making the work meaningful through your reading of it. And I think that's what I appreciate with my own work, when someone has like read it actually, and it can be not exactly how I intended, but I appreciate what they bring to it and how they've read. And I think that's so much of experimental work, is like what you bring from your background and your knowledge. And I think it's, in my sense, the same across the board. Like I feel that way when I see performance, that I'm less familiar with performance, or like music that's more experimental, where it's not really, I don't know it, I didn't study it, I don't understand why making sound in this way is like like interesting or legitimate, but I have to think about it, and sometimes it really clicks, and other times it doesn't. And I think I appreciate that. I like the process of reading.
That feels really meaningful too, that you're talking about like expanding, I don't know, genres in a way that's sort of more capacious, but also the importance of the audience. You need the audience member in a way that, I mean, yes, theoretically, I hope that we need audience members in narrative theater pieces, because we hope that there's also interpretation and understanding happening. But it sounds like they're playing a different role here in experimental film, and that's really meaningful to have such a conversation and to really want to be in a different kind of dialogue, perhaps, with that audience.
I also keep thinking about what you said about accessing the visceral. And in these more experimental forms, I find myself needing to trust what I'm feeling viscerally more. Again, there's not that narrative to tell me why I'm feeling the ways I'm feeling, or what the story is. It's that gut, whatever emotions are coming up, whatever you're noticing is what you need to use to work to figure out what this means and what this means to you. And so it feels like this form also connects audiences to the visceral more directly. I don't know if that's also it sounds like also that resonates with what you were saying earlier about, where you try to go with your work.
Totally, totally. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, because it's also an active process of my self-questioning. I mean, sometimes I have a hard time explaining what a work is or what, like, I have a hard time summing it up because for me, it's also questions that I'm posing through this very structured, like, form. I mean, experimental is also, for me, is not totally, there's an aspect of it that's very free, but there's an aspect of it that's highly structured and very precise in how I'm making something. And I think, like, oftentimes it's, I'm trying to work through something. I'm asking these questions of myself in this form. And so it's not that I'm like, I have the answers and I'm proposing it to someone to try and figure it out. I feel we're both figuring it out together. So it's an engagement between the maker and the viewer, I think, where, I'm just like organizing the things in a particular way and then saying, like, so what does it mean? Let's together figure it out, you know?
So what are you working on right now, if you don't mind revealing?
I don't. I mean, work is hard in this last year. I have to preface by saying that. It's been, and I think it's important to talk about because I think a lot of makers right now are feeling, like writers and filmmakers, musicians, all of us are feeling quite crushed, I would say, that it's a really difficult moment to keep making. And yet, I have to convince myself of this often, but, like, I think it's really important to keep making because it's, I think Muhammad al-Kurd actually talked about this in an article that he wrote that was published in September of 2023, so right before the beginning of the genocide. And he says something about, like, what is art, for art's sake in this, more or less, let's say I'm paraphrasing, in this moment, like, how does it contribute to the struggle? And is it really going to liberate us to keep making art? And he's, by the end of the article, he's sort of explaining that, like, every piece is kind of an accumulation of something. And it's really powerful to read that, I think, as an artist, that no one poem, no rap song, no film is going to liberate Palestine. And it's not going to, like, you can't use it at a checkpoint, but actually the accumulation of people making work, Palestinians or otherwise making work about Palestine, is like building towards liberation, no single one thing. And I'm using that now to keep working because it's hard. It feels futile in certain ways and honestly a bit grotesque to be, like, sitting around thinking about production when people are being rounded up and exterminated in Jabalia right now. Like, it doesn't sit well, but I think I'm trying to work. I had this idea for a piece that looks at, so I've moved to Berlin, sorry to preface this, I moved to Berlin almost 5 years ago, during COVID, and it was kind of a happenstance. Like, I wasn't planning to move, but I ended up deciding to stay, found an incredible community. But I have a child and decided, like, maybe this is a good place to raise my child, which sounds a bit funny now, but it's the third time technically that I immigrate, that I'm an immigrant somewhere in my life. And I'm really sensitive, I think, to, questions of integration and how migrant populations are treated. It feels like that's the history of my life, is just being a foreigner under everywhere under the mercy of different governments and states and national identities and all this bullshit. And so, it's the third time doing it. Now I have a child, so I'm seeing the effects it has on him and the school system. And Germany's a very, like, wow, their culture is very present and very dominant and frankly very xenophobic and racist. And so this was before October of last year, I started developing a kind of short, actually, narrative film, much more narrative than anything I've done, that would look at, like, the big ideas of it's looking at integration and how migrant populations are treated through the experience of a child entering kindergarten and experiencing separation anxiety, and making a parallel between the separation anxiety we experience as children as the one we experience as adults, as immigrants to places when we can't go back home. And so it's a very, like, kind of poetic, visceral, again, like, narrative in 3 parts, where we're seeing a father and his son in their morning routine, and as the child gets dropped off for daycare that ends in a sort of surprising way that I won't reveal. But so I've been in development for it, much slower than usual, but I should be shooting early next year, actually. And I was going to say, so I had this idea before October, and the piece is really critical of, like Western cultural hegemony and the racist sort of policies that Europeans have, especially Northern Europeans, against migrants, specifically Arab, but sort of all migrants. And when October happened, I was just like, never mind. Like, why would I make this film? This is ridiculous, and forget it. And I need to not make work actually for a bit. And then I brought back up the project of when a friend was asking me about it, and because the people commissioning it actually were still very much encouraging that I keep making the work, and I have to like really thank them for that. But yeah, I brought it up to a friend saying like, what on earth why would I make this film? And she told me like, actually, I think this film speaks to what's happening in Palestine so much without directly addressing it, which is anyways impossible right now. And so, yeah, so I got encouraged and developed the script and have started to sort of put the pieces in place and feel against all odds, we'll try to make the piece happen and see where it goes.
Thank you for sharing that with us. It's been an incredibly hard time just to be a human and to be watching this happen, and then also to be making art on top of it. When I appreciate the Muhammad al-Kurd, like that it's cumulative, that it all adds up to something. And I'm in a Palestinian book club with Noor, Basma's cousin, who, we're just giving shout outs to the family members of Basma.
By all means.
We're reading Wissam Rafidi's Trinity of Fundamentals, which was recently translated into English, and some other that's sort of spiraled into us reading other prison literature. The book was written while he was in prison and then smuggled out of prison. And now translates and is in circulation. But it's interesting to me that him and other political prisoners have chosen fiction as like this medium, that they've written accounts of their lives that are fictionalized for, I'm sure, legitimate reasons. But like using this medium to be able to communicate something with this audience. And I feel like the prison literature in that way is also like a cumulative, where I feel like, I'm getting this education in this fictional way, but it's still really giving a piece of this larger puzzle that is necessary for my life, but for maybe all of our lives. It just felt like a tie-in with how you were speaking about.
I mean, it's interesting that you bring that up, because also one of the things that really, really, to go back to your first question, like one of the things that really inspired me when I was a teenager was the work of Cuban writers. And I'd never been to Cuba. I didn't know a Cuban person. I had never met a Cuban person. I was growing up in Chicago, and someone had given me Reynaldo Arenas's memoirs. It's a terrible movie that was made by Julian Schnabel, but based on the memoir. But the memoir itself just like blew my mind, and like really, I felt like I was there. And it's it's the story of his life. But then I then read like his other works, which are really experimental and weird and like very hallucinatory kind of literature. And so he's someone who like fought in the revolution for Castro and then becomes ostracized by him, imprisoned, publishes his memoir or other. I can't remember if it was smuggled several of his books out while he was imprisoned, and then eventually like is out of prison and then is in exile in the United States. Like he just lived a life of like immense struggle and just trauma, and has these incredible books, this incredible literature that I found so I don't know, they just like they would just like transport me into another world. They weren't even necessarily explaining to me the history of like Cuba or, what their struggle was. I mean, in part, yes, I think I started to understand it, but it's a place I'd never visited and didn't know anyone from. And I thought like, this is so beautiful. Like he made work against all odds when it was totally useless or hopeless, not useless, hopeless. And it reached me, this like teenager in Chicago who was Palestinian in diaspora. And it just gave me the sense of like, this is what we have to do, because it's important when you're not under the bombs and when you're not living under occupation to like have also this like, it's like a testament to your will to survive, is to make art, to make something that isn't actually for your survival, but it just really, I don't know, I think it reaches people in this way that's really powerful and really, I'm not saying this like in the right way, but I was so moved by this writing. And then when I went, I got to go to Cuba actually for the first time, I think 3 years ago. And it was so funny to be there and to think like, this place actually, I owe the reason for like starting to make art, because it was a question like, why do this frivolous thing? Does it amount to anything? And then being handed this book and thinking like, yes, absolutely. It's very powerful. It's very important to make art that isn't just political and documentary and whatever, but stuff that can make you imagine things and dream, and sort of like, just in response to like, fiction, like to enter these worlds that aren't real is super important. Yeah.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, I think I'm on a whole like Palestinian futurity kick with some of the films that I'm like watching and thinking about, and it feels very difficult to be thinking about the future right now, but also immensely necessary, especially if you're in a position right now to be able to think about the future, then it needs to be done, so that those who are not able to think about it every moment right now can also then join in.
Well, we've come to the end of our time together, and that's a beautiful way to end, to thinking about the future and reflecting on what art even means right now, which is a lot of this season, to be honest, what has come up this season from so many artists, considering what that means. So thank you for illuminating that for us as well, Basma, and for all of your work.
Thank you so much for inviting me to this and to the conversation, and for the very thoughtful questions.
This podcast is produced as a contribution to HowlRound Theatre Commons. You can find more episodes of Kunafa and Shay and other HowlRound podcasts by searching HowlRound wherever you find podcasts. If you loved this podcast, please post a rating and write a review on your platform of choice. This helps other people find us. You can also find a transcript for this episode, along with a lot of other progressive and disruptive content, on the HowlRound.com website. Have an idea for an exciting podcast, essay, or TV event the theater community needs to hear? Visit HowlRound.com and contribute your ideas to the Commons.
Yalla, bye!